Hey everybody, thanks for jumping on the live. See so many names in the chat. Hey everyone. Bailey Edgar first. Hey Bailey. Johnny Tumbelina, Carol, Pink, KJ, LH. Hey Carrie, Joanne, Duels, Jen, Honeybee, Missy, ARI Housewife, Letty, always good to see you. Angelane, Taylor, welcome. Finally caught a live. 1 a.m. in the UK. I know it's early in Australia. It's evening here where I am in the US. So look at all of us together here to talk about the case. So yeah, there's some new documents out. The big one is some more insights around the DNA evidence. We have talked in some of the past lives that we've done about the possibility that they would have ran Bryan's DNA now and compared it, to the evidence that they have, his actual DNA versus kind of that genealogy connection. And then there were some earlier documents regarding the genealogy, kind of going back and forth within the court. The defense was kind of pursuing that angle. But in this new document, the prosecution really kind of pushes back on that. So this is about a 30-page motion that was filed here by the prosecution. And what they're asking here is to protect some of the information that came to light throughout the investigation and in identifying Bryan as the suspect who left the DNA. So I'm going to show the document here real quick, and then I'm going to hide it again. It's probably hard to read on the screen. Let me see what everybody prefers. Put a 1, everyone, please. If you want me to leave the document up like this, I can hide it though if you don't want to stare at the document. But I'm going to go through some of it, and there's a couple of things I specifically wanted to point out, and there are actually a couple of items that I did talk about in some past videos that I did. One thing was I had clarified in the affidavit they were discussing a single source of male DNA, and I'd done a past video kind of talking about how what I believe they meant was that it was single source DNA, and that's kind of more of a scientific term regarding, the way that they process DNA. You can have single source DNA. You can also have DNA that has multiple profiles in it, but they are able to distinguish between the two, and they can actually determine which is the more dominant of the two DNAs and kind of figure out, where it would have come from. Or, for example, if I were to touch a doorknob or if I were to shake your hand and then go touch a doorknob, your DNA would be on the doorknob, but my DNA would be the primary source there. It would override. They would be able to tell the difference there. So without getting too much into the DNA piece of it, essentially what they're talking about here is they've identified a single source of DNA from this knife sheath, and that DNA was identified as being a male DNA early on. Let's see if we can get this. There we go. Let's get the chat up for a second and say hi to everyone. There we go. Can see that a little better maybe. All right. Yeah, if you close the chat, you can do, but you have to choose them between chatting and reading the document. It's too fun to chat. Okay. So let's take a look here. And let me jump over to this screen. All right, so this is the document that was filed. I'm going to read through it a little bit. There's also a few phrases in the document that I thought that I liked, essentially the way that the prosecution worded it. And then I also, at the end of the video, I have a question I wanted to ask everyone. I've mentioned before that I'm kind of intrigued about Ann Taylor and whether or not she thinks Bryan Kohberger is guilty. But after we review this document, I have another question I want to ask everyone, and then get your thoughts on that. So this document starts off, it says, "Come now, the state of Idaho, by and through Latah County. The prosecuting attorney moves the court for a protective order pursuant to ICR 16. So they want to protect information related to the investigative genetic genealogy in the case. So to sum up their argument on that piece, what they're saying here is they looked into Bryan's family tree, essentially, and there's many people connected to these family trees out there. And they want to protect those people, those innocent people's information. That's what they're essentially saying here in relation to the genetic genealogy investigation. So this is the first thing I really like about this filing, is they're reminding right off the bat the importance of this case, where they say this case arises from a quadruple homicide. And we can lose sight of that over time and how heinous this crime was. And this one in particular, I think we can all agree, since we're here right now talking about it, hit a nerve with all of us in one way or another. So this is a very high profile. This is a big deal. This case needed to be solved, and they were uncovering, they were leaving no stone unturned in this investigation. But I like how they kind of state that right off the bat. So law enforcement found the DNA of a potential suspect at the crime scene, and the FBI submitted the DNA to one or more publicly available genetic genealogy services to determine potential relatives of the suspect. So right away here, it was not the FBI who discovered the DNA. This was the local people at the scene who found the knife sheath, and then they started working on that DNA evidence. The FBI then became involved later and then started doing their own processing of this evidence. So if there's anyone out there who's kind of, looking at the angle of, well, this is law enforcement framing Bryan or something along those lines, well, you have to figure now you have multiple agencies involved in that framing of Bryan. So it can't just be the local boys in Moscow who have come up with this little plan. You've got the FBI as well. So if you're going to say that, you've got to consider, you have multiple agencies, multiple departments across the state, multiple states working on this case. So they would all have to be in cahoots together, right, to go and get Bryan. So just on that topic. So essentially the FBI submitted DNA, and they used common genealogical techniques to develop a family tree leading to the defendant. The state seeks to protect from disclosure the names and personal information of the hundreds of innocent relatives on the family tree, the names of the publicly available genetic genealogy services used, and certain other information that they describe below in this document. So here's where we get a little more insight on the sheath and the DNA, and they actually do clarify here that it is the DNA came from a single source. So on November 13th, law enforcement found the bodies of Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. They had all died of apparent knife wounds. They found a K-bar knife sheath on the bed next to the bodies of Madison and Kaylee. So we have confirmation here that Madison and Kaylee were found on the bodies once, in the same bed once again. And then the knife sheath was found face down, partially under Madison's body, and the comforter on the bed. So that's just a new piece of insight there regarding the comforter that we hadn't heard before. And they're also explaining that the knife sheath was face down. So that was documented somewhere. I'm sure they took photographs of the knife sheath. Law enforcement seized the K-bar knife sheath pursuant to a search warrant. So this is another thing that I did talk about in a past video, where we were reviewing some of the documents on the Idaho Gov site, and they had actually applied for a warrant for the house at 1122 King Road. And I was talking a little bit about they'll do that even though it's the victim's home, because they're covering their bases there, right? So they're going to be removing items from the house, and they've got a search warrant. Here's the example there of what that search warrant was for at 1122 King Road, is because right here it came full circle, and they're now referencing the fact that they got that search warrant, even though you would think, oh, it's a murder scene, a crime scene, they can go in and just pick up the evidence. But no, they actually went that extra step and got the warrant before, for processing of the evidence here. So that's good. Kudos to the prosecution there. The Idaho State Police Lab in Idaho located DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. The laboratory determined the DNA came from a single source, and that source was male. So once they had single source DNA from the knife sheath, they conducted what is called short tandem analysis, short tandem repeat analysis. So they look at different regions within human DNA, and that allows law enforcement to make a direct comparison between two DNA profiles. So they submitted that profile that they had gotten from the sheath to the Combined DNA Index System. We've all heard of that, the CODIS database, right? Where all the criminals' DNA is stored and who knows who else's, but they submitted it to CODIS. And then this is key here, I think, too. It says there was no match found within CODIS. So they eliminated a lot of people there, right? There's a lot of convicted offenders, arrestees, other evidence from other locations, and there was no match. So that also tells us that they don't have a match from other crimes about Bryan, right? So the Dana Smithers case, for example, or any other case, doesn't mean that, maybe there isn't some connection somewhere to another case, but as far as DNA from another crime scene in CODIS, an unsolved case, for example, Bryan's DNA did not match any of that. So there's a lot of little insights here we can gain from some of what they reveal in this motion. So unable to find a match using that analysis, they decided to use genetic genealogy to find a lead. Not to prove the case in court, right? They're not gonna go to court and use the genealogy family tree and all of that in what they're looking for is a lead. And that's exactly what they're going to explain later in this document. Is this was an investigation. This is a process. Because what the defense was asking for in their filing was all of those bits of information, all of those people that were hits on that genealogy testing. The defense was wanting all of that. And that's where we heard the response back from the state, where they said, hey, we don't intend to use that information, so you don't need it. This isn't exculpatory evidence or anything like that. And so they actually clarify that more in this document as well. But the genetic genealogy was used to find a lead, to find a suspect. Now, once you have a suspect, then you can follow up to confirm the guilt, right? Or to confirm other things. So this was just to find a lead. So genetic genealogy allows people to trace their lineage, right? With unknown family members. So there could be people out there related to Bryan that they don't even know each other, and law enforcement doesn't necessarily want those people's information or feel that that information is irrelevant for the defense, that they don't need that information. Because they're not going to use it in court anyway. So basically, places like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, you can send in saliva and they can generate a profile and generate a family tree, essentially, right? So this is what law enforcement did. So the genetic genealogy service uses an algorithm to compare the user's profile to other profiles submitted to the service by other users to determine ancestry and potential relatives. So this same process that everybody uses to check their ancestry can also be used by law enforcement as part of their investigation. It's a technique referred to as investigative genetic genealogy, IGG. Once a publicly available genetic genealogy service shows law enforcement potential relatives of the suspect, law enforcement applies traditional investigative methods to build a family tree in an effort to follow the tree to the suspect or close relative of the suspect. In this case, investigators used IgG to begin the process of developing a lead to the individual who left DNA on the knife sheath at the scene. So here's where I think some people were talking a little bit about the processing of the DNA and maybe the defense questioning that or something to that extent. But it says here, the Idaho State Police utilized a private laboratory to develop a profile from the DNA from the knife sheath. That private lab started using genetic genealogy to develop a family tree. But after law enforcement decided the FBI would take over, the private lab ceased its efforts and sent the profile to the DNA, or sent the DNA profile to the FBI. Okay, so that I think is where we had heard a little bit about the chain of custody of the DNA and how it was tested. The FBI uploaded the profile to one or more publicly available genetic genealogy services to identify possible family members. And then they could even go into the portal of, for example, 23andMe, and they can look up information and things like that. So based off of what they were able to see, they started building out a family tree of the genetic relatives of the suspect. So they essentially just use what's available to the public in order to, they signed up and they, submitted the DNA, and that's where they got that lead from. So it says, for example, the FBI also consulted social media. They viewed vital records such as birth and death certificates. They viewed other information already contained in the user portal for the genetic genealogy service, including unverified information submitted by other users of the service. They also consulted subscription-based databases available to law enforcement for information on individual people. So it says the product of the genealogy conducted by the FBI was a family tree that contained the name, birthday, and death rate of hundreds of relatives, as well as their familial connections between each other and the suspect, Bryan Kohberger. The FBI then sent to local law enforcement a tip to investigate Bryan Kohberger. Okay, so they essentially found Bryan, all of these people all connected, including Bryan. And then from there, they pursued the trash DNA evidence and took the next step of confirming that it was a 99.998% chance that it was somebody a direct descendant of Bryan's dad, right? So they clarify here that the IgG process pointed law enforcement toward the defendant, but it did not provide law enforcement with substantive evidence of guilt. So the FBI did not, for example, conduct a direct comparison between the DNA profile from the K-bar and the defendant's profile, right? This was just a genealogy connection. So before the FBI got involved, the private lab that they were using for the testing had also developed a traditional, profile from the K-bar sheath. So after Bryan was identified, they recovered trash from the home of his parents. And the trash belonged to the biological father of the individual who left the DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. So this is actually, multiple layers of DNA evidence and testing. If the defense is going to go after this and try to dispute this, it's going to be challenging, right? They're going to really have to try to find some argument here that Bryan's Fourth Amendment right was violated to some extent, and that this information was gathered, unlawfully, because the information is pointing right at Bryan as being the suspect, right? I think it's going to be very hard for the defense to challenge the validity of the DNA testing and the processing of it. They're going to have to find a breakdown here or a violation that they've committed in order to dispute this. And then this also opens the door to a lot of other things to consider, because now you have Bryan at the crime scene, right? You have his DNA at the crime scene. So essentially, they took the DNA from the knife sheath after Bryan was taken into custody. They took a swab from Bryan, and then they compared that swab for Bryan to the DNA that they had from the knife sheath. And it showed a statistical match. And Carol mentioned it early on in the chat. She said the word of the week is Octillion. So this profile, Bryan's DNA matched the DNA on the knife sheath recovered from the crime scene. We can now say that, everybody. Before it was, allegedly it was Bryan's, the father of the suspect, the descendant. In this case, we can say now that it's at least 5.37 octillion times more likely to be Bryan than anybody else, essentially. That's 27 zeros, Pink said. Yep. So there's 20 numbers on. If we look at the charts with big numbers, names, you have million, you have a billion, you have a trillion, quadrillion, quintillion. This is number 8 on the list of 20. 27 zeros. It's octillion. I don't know how many that is. I don't know how many septillion that is. But that's a lot, right? MSP says all the way in Europe. We're still here live right now. So MSP new documents. Essentially, the prosecution is arguing back, saying, number one, the defense doesn't need the genealogy results, all of the information from the genealogy investigation, because we're not using it. This just led us to the suspect. And then number two, they now have Bryan's DNA from the crime scene, matches the knife sheath, and it's 5.37 octillion times more likely to be him than anybody else. So this is going to be something the defense is really going to have to strategize around. Do they, are they just going full bore after finding a violation and trying to get this evidence thrown out somehow, chain of custody or however, or they somehow violated Bryan's rights because they ran this genealogical test through a public service? But if they're going to argue that, are they then going to argue that it wasn't fair that they looked at who the girls were following on Instagram, or who Bryan may have been following on Instagram? Are they not allowed to look at that public database either? So I don't think they have really a leg to stand on here as far as pursuing an argument against law enforcement using this. And this isn't the first time that this technique has been used. So the defense is going to have to decide now, okay, what's our strategy? Bryan's at the scene of the crime. So you either have to debunk the DNA or you have to explain how it got there. Doesn't mean he necessarily committed the murder, but he was there at the crime scene. Now, we don't know if there's any other DNA at that scene that they recovered from anywhere else or anybody else at the scene. They haven't released that information yet. We've speculated that they could have more. But they were running the knife sheath DNA very early on, right? They had it right away. But it brings me back to that dynamic between Ann Taylor and Bryan Kohberger, and if she believes he's guilty. She knows now. We know she knows that they have the knife sheath from the crime scene and it's got Bryan's DNA on it. What has Bryan told her about it? What's his explanation to her? Drives me crazy. I want to know what Bryan Kohberger has told Ann Taylor about the knife sheath. So the state goes on here to explain that basically the FBI used a public database and they just kind of created these leads, and they don't really have evidence of this to turn over to the defense, right? There's no way for them to kind of go back and pull up all of the stuff that they reviewed, but they have notes and things like that that they can hand over, but those are going to be limited. So they're explaining here that this genealogical DNA analysis was a process, and all of the findings, all of the people that they kind of looked at and filtered through isn't any evidence that's relevant to the case. The evidence that's relevant to the case is the actual DNA from the scene and it matching Bryan Kohberger is their argument, right? They also go on to clarify that they did not use the genealogical results in the grand jury indictment. So they focused on the end result, right? The actual match from the swab from Bryan's cheek matching the DNA from the knife sheath. That's the evidence they're going to submit in trial. That's what they're going to use. Not the genealogical testing that led them to Bryan, but the actual evidence that puts Bryan there. So essentially that's what they do here in these next few pages, is they go on to explain that it's not necessarily the testing process that matters, it's the end result. And the testing process that they used is a publicly available database. And so, there's no violation there. The other thing that I really like that they mention here, let me see if I can find it. But they're essentially saying that the defendant is entitled to evidence that would be exculpatory, right? That would imply Bryan's innocence. But it mentions here this rule that says that the state has to disclose any material or information in the prosecuting attorney's possession or control that tends to negate the guilt of the accused as to the offense charged, or that would tend to reduce the punishment. So it says it does not require the prosecutor to make a complete and detailed accounting to the defense of all police investigatory work on a case, right? And then they go on and they actually mention in this document that, if anything, this process is inculpatory for Bryan Kohberger, not exculpatory. So that's the opposite. It actually would imply more guilt, right? So it says here, Rule 16, the state seeks to protect I'm sorry, let me back up. It says, because the investigative information the state seeks to protect is not favorable to the defendant on the issues of guilt or punishment, the information provided to local law enforcement was nothing more than, by the FBI, was nothing more than a tip. Okay, so that's not the evidence that matters. And then it says, the genealogical tip did not prove or substantiate the defendant's guilt. Rather, the tip allowed local law enforcement to focus their investigation on the defendant and obtain independent material evidence of his guilt, all of which the state has disclosed or will disclose. Specifically with respect to DNA, an STR DNA analysis found the defendant's DNA matched the DNA collected from the K-bar knife sheath. And then, to the extent the investigative information has any relevance, the fact that it led law enforcement to the defendant means it's inculpatory rather than exculpatory in nature, right? It's a good point. So the defense is saying, hey, we want this information. We want this grand jury information because it's exculpatory. And the prosecution is saying here, no, this is DNA evidence that is, if anything, it's inculpatory. But they're going to both argue either side on that, right? The defense is going to say it's exculpatory because they're going to argue, well, maybe some right of Bryan's was violated in the process, right? The prosecution is arguing more that it led them to that end result, and that's what matters. And then they go on to say that the investigative information, they're referring to the genealogical information here, it's not material to the preparation of the defense. The defendant is charged with killing 4 people, not with being related to a particular person, right? So the mere fact that uploading the profile into a publicly available genetic genealogy service led them to Bryan Kohberger does not affect the strength of the evidence against him. And then they go on to argue that the strength basically depends upon the result, on if his DNA matches that profile or not at the end of the day, right? I'm going to pause real quick and just check the comments. So KJ says, I don't think the defense has much defense at this point. I don't know if they've had much of a defense from the very beginning. And that's a great segue into the question I'm going to ask everybody at the end of the video here. Because I'm really curious to hear what everyone thinks. But he's going to have to blame his evil twin. Somebody's inspiring sobriety. Thank you. Thank you for the 10. Inspiring sobriety says, thank you. I love your soothing voice and level-headed commentary. Thanks for being rational. Yes, thank you. I try. Sometimes, though, I'm guilty. I can fall into that trap like everyone else. So A99 says, the question is, did they find any other DNA evidence? Yeah, big question there. I personally think they have, but we don't know. More to come on that. Missy Q, always, I love how Missy Q is not afraid to kind of go against the majority and state her case. 2 roommates never called 911. What proof out there do we have anyone called? Yeah, exactly. We haven't heard a 911 call. We don't know who called yet, even. So there's a lot of details there. More to come that we're going to learn on that. Yeah, so R.I. Housewife says, not negating the DNA, need more than the sheath, like victim DNA in his car or apartment under the victim's fingernails, other than just the sheath. Yeah. Now, that's a good point, because let's say that's all they had is the knife sheath, and there's not a sliver of other DNA evidence. That's something the defense, I think, could leverage, and that's something that they could bring up in the trial and talk about that. So that's absolutely, if that's the case, that's good for Bryan. If that's the case, right? We just don't know what else is at the scene. From what we've heard, it was a pretty messy scene. The other thing, too, that I think we forget about is there's other analysis aside from DNA. DNA is the strongest, but there's other ways that they can recreate crime scenes. And so they're going to be looking at cast off and things like that. There's going to be blood on the ceilings and walls and they have ways to kind of determine the height of the suspect. They can, they're going to have kind of a theory to some extent. So there's going to be a lot of little things that kind of all come together to make up the whole case. But definitely the defense is going to want to break it down, individual pieces of evidence, and try to dispute those. And if there's only DNA on the knife sheath, absolutely. Yeah, that's good for them. Running Bear says satellite data will put him there. Yep, combination, right? It's not one. It's this is the big one. The DNA. I mean, that's the most solid. That's going to be the hardest one to explain. But what does he say? How do you explain it away? What has he said? It drives me crazy. I want to know what he has told Ann Taylor about where he was that night and the DNA. Can't wait for the trial, KJ. All right, let's jump back over here. So the prosecution is, just to summarize, they're saying, hey, the steps to get there aren't important. It's the end result. And I'm sure that they're confident they haven't violated any of Bryan's rights. We hope that these people who handled this case handled it properly. And the way the case unfolded leads me to believe that it did. Remember, this was real quiet for a long time. They weren't releasing anything. They were getting a lot of criticism about the handling of the case. And then all of a sudden, boom, they had him. And I think that there was a lot of work being done there. They brought the prosecutor in, Bill Thompson, I think it was Thanksgiving Day in November. So this was just a couple weeks after the murders. We saw Bill Thompson arriving there at the police station. So he was involved right from the get-go. And so we had eyes on this, from that perspective early on. And so I lean that they have everything buttoned up here with how this was handled. So they're referencing other cases here and just arguing their case. And then it's saying here, moreover, the investigative information could not support an argument from the defendant that law enforcement violated his Fourth Amendment rights by entering the DNA collected from the K-bar knife sheath into a genealogy service. This is the part I really like. A defendant cannot prove a violation of the Fourth Amendment without first showing he or she had a reasonable expectation of privacy in the place searched. The K-bar knife sheath was abandoned at the scene, as was the DNA inside it. The defendant cannot show that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy in DNA left at the scene of a quadruple homicide or in the genetic information of his relatives who voluntarily provided their own DNA to a genetic genealogy service. So they're basically saying, hey, he left it there. So it's ours now, right? Shouldn't have left it there. And then this part's really interesting. It says, second, the state did not rely on the investigative information to establish probable cause for the defendant's arrest. They did not present the investigative information to the grand jury, and they have no plans to present the investigative information for which a protective order is sought as evidence at trial. They just want to protect parts of this. They just want to protect the innocent people there, those names. That's all they're trying to do there. And then they actually kind of go further on to say, hey, if for whatever reason this information has to get out, they have some other criteria there. So their goal here is simply just to protect informant or witness information in this filing. It says, they have no plans to present the investigative information for which a protective order is sought as evidence at trial. Instead, the state has relied on and will continue to rely on the DNA analysis comparing Bryan's DNA to the DNA on the K-bar knife sheath to establish the defendant's guilt. And it says they've disclosed and they will disclose information related to the DNA analysis conducted in connection with the case. So that they have disclosed it to the defense, right? It says, third, the documents and tangible objects encompassed in the investigation information were not obtained from the defendant, and the defendant has no property interest in them. To the extent the DNA on the knife sheath once belonged to the defendant, he abandoned that DNA when he left it at the crime scene of a quadruple homicide. The defendant has never had a property interest in the records that reflect the DNA profile developed from the DNA on the knife sheath, nor has he ever had a property interest in the information gathered from the genealogy service using the DNA profile. It says basically none of the investigative information the state seeks to protect came directly from the defendant. So they're referring to the information in this motion that they're filing to protect here. That's what they're arguing in this case. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. They, again, they're requesting information be sealed. They're arguing that the defense does not have an entitlement essentially to the grand jury information and the genealogy investigative process that they were requesting. They cited all of the reasons why. And then they're arguing that, they feel there's good cause exists for the court to enter an order protecting the investigative information. And then, if necessary, hold an in-camera hearing to discuss it. So I mentioned I had a question for everyone. Yeah, 6 foot even, 185 according to his license, Harlot. So let's jump over here to, whoops. Let's get the chat back. There it goes. Whoops. Let's move this up to the top. So Missy Q says this should be a slam dunk case. DNA everywhere. So yeah, they're only going to give us so this motion that they're filing is specific to that, right? So that's what they're talking about. That's the only reason we're even seeing that information at all. Up until now, we hadn't heard any results about the DNA testing from Bryan. And so the only reason we're seeing it is because of this document that came out where they're filing a motion against something else, and then they're referencing, the investigative technique and the DNA. And that's why we just kind of get that glimpse there, right? So they're not gonna tell us everything. They're gonna keep, and same thing in the affidavit, right? They're not gonna release. They're releasing only enough to get the mission accomplished, right? To get the warrant, to get to that next step. And then they redact it even more, probably with this case going on. Yeah, Claire. So says thinking their DNA has to be somewhere, or something he owns, the car. They did gather hair from his apartment. There was a positive test for blood. We don't know whose blood. It could have been his own blood. But there was a positive test there. We don't know whose and those things yet, but could be more. Think about it. They went into Bryan's apartment and they found a dog hair, as it's described, an animal hair or dog hair. So they, imagine going into someone's house and, who doesn't own a dog, and looking through their apartment and having to find hairs, right? So they went through that apartment with a fine-tooth comb, literally. And so, I'm sure they pulled the drain out, of the showers and things like that. So we'll see. A few places I'm interested in the vehicle would be the seat belt, because the seat belt can retract inside to, where you can't really get to it to wash it. So that's a possibility. I wonder about the keys, the car keys, and maybe inside the ignition, if there was anything on a car key. A lot of little nooks and crannies, right? And then inside the house, of course, we've looked at pictures inside the house, and you can see how close quarters it is in there, and so I would imagine there was transfer of blood to some extent. But it's interesting because the defense still, we haven't heard the alibi angle, right? We haven't heard anything mentioned about saying no, he wasn't there, or he's innocent because of this, or he has an alibi. It's all been attacking the evidence and looking for some sort of Fourth Amendment violation or something like that. I think that's pretty telling. So that said, here's the question, everyone. Now that, I've asked the question before, what you thought about Ann Taylor and whether or not she thinks Bryan is guilty. So I'm still intrigued by that. But I had another one I wanted to ask. Put yourself in Bryan Kohberger's shoes. Imagine you're Bryan Kohberger, and imagine you're guilty of this crime. And here they have your DNA on the knife sheath at the murder scene. Would you tell Ann Taylor that you did it? Or would you argue to Ann Taylor, no, it wasn't me? And so here we have that exact scenario. We have Bryan's DNA at the crime scene on the knife sheath. I feel like there's a, pretty good chance that he was there at a minimum. So if you're Bryan Kohberger Do you lie to the person, the one person who's there to protect you and try to get you free? Or do you open up to that person and be like, you know what? Yeah, I did it, but you know, let's I need you to find a way to get me off, from being convicted for this crime. He has nothing to lose, right? She can't go and disclose that. So he can trust her to that extent. So what do you think is the better strategy for Bryan? Is it a better strategy for Bryan to lie and say, no, it wasn't me. No, the DNA there, I don't know. Right? What is he telling her on how that DNA got there? Or is he admitting to it? And then they're trying to, so I almost feel like it would be in Bryan's better interest to be honest with her, disclose every little detail about that night and what he did so that they could maybe find some sort of way to argue against the evidence, versus lying to his defense attorney and trying to pretend that he's innocent with all of this evidence pointing against him. So I'm curious what everybody thinks. If you were Bryan, you did it, they've got your DNA on the knife sheath and you're sitting across from the table, Ann Taylor's right there. Do you lie to her and say, no, wasn't me? Or do you admit it was you and then come up with a strategy together as a team to try to imply that you're innocent? Thanks for joining me, everybody. So yeah, 1 in 5.37 octillion likelihood that it's Bryan. I don't know if I explained that right, but it's a big number. So that's going to be really tough to explain away. But let me know what you think in the comments about that question. Keep an eye out. I'm going to jump back on tomorrow for another live. I'll catch you then. Thanks for joining tonight. Have a good night, everyone.